Hello, and welcome to our Neely Center video series on decisions and ethics. I'm Ali Abbas, the director of the Neely Center, and today we have a very special guest, Ken Fletcher. Ken is the former Chief Risk Officer of the Transportation Security Administration and indeed one of the masterminds of the TSA program. Ken, welcome.
Thank you, Ali. I appreciate it.
So let's start by telling us a little bit about your background and the history of how you started and how you got then later into risk management and then eventually into the Transportation Security Administration.
So I think about my background in kind of 5 phases. So I started off enlisted in the Navy right after high school. That was kind of the first phase. I got my commission as a limited duty officer specializing in electronics. That was kind of the second phase. I left the Navy, retired after 23 years. I went to work for Motorola. I swore I would never work for the government. I swore I would never consult for the government, work for a Beltway bandit. When I left the Navy, I was going to make my fame and fortune in the private sector. And then 9/11 hit. And making and selling cell phones just had no meaning beyond, no value beyond the financial benefits of being in the corporate world. I spent about 9 months reaching out to everyone I knew that was in the military or was in Washington working for the federal government, and I got a call from a former commanding officer of mine who asked if I was willing to come to Washington. She was looking for a chief of staff. She was the assistant administrator for training at that time, and a week later I had packed up my truck. I had loaded my kids, left my wife behind to finish out the school year with my son, and I moved to Maryland. What got me really into risk management is I had the opportunity to be selected for the Homeland Security's master's program at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. And during one of the first papers we had to write was on a policy. So, you know, being a student who always looked for the easy way out, you write about what you know, right? So I wrote about aviation security. I was completely frustrated with the expectations that were being continuously placed on the frontline transportation security officer. TSA, in response to every new threat targeted towards aviation, simply layered additional procedures and new technologies, so that the complexity of the job was becoming overwhelming, cognitively overwhelming for the frontline officer. At the same time that we were expecting them to myopically focus on finding a variety of prohibited objects, things like improvised explosive devices that could take down an airplane, to small penknives and sewing scissors that probably aren't going to do any damage to anybody on board the aircraft. And so I came across an article written by Robert Poole from the Reason Foundation, and he had put forward this idea of a registered traveler program in 2004. And so I wrote my policy paper on that, and I said, government actually knows a lot about people. Why do we need to treat everyone who comes on board the aircraft as if they pose an equal and unknown threat? Everybody could be a potential terrorist operative. So that's a very inefficient way to do business. So the paper got well received, and I decided that that's what I was going to write my thesis on. And then for a variety of circumstances, new administrator, post Christmas Day underwear bomber attack, all of the more intrusive, more invasive, more cumbersome security procedures, and trying to apply them equally across, roughly 2 million people a day. Really, the system just became, it was melting down. The agency was headed to crisis, and my policy paper and my thesis got new life. When I first sent that off to Washington, the response I got was, if you write your thesis on that, you're putting your career in jeopardy, because there is no appetite to do anything than what we've been doing since 9/11. I said, it's the right thing to do. I'm going to stick my neck out there, and timing was good. So, yeah.
So were there any challenges during the inspiration period of creating an expedited screening program? Were there the types of conversations that occurred, the pros, cons, perhaps?
There was a lot of challenges and a lot of policy decisions. So at a conceptual level, my research paper, my thesis, the traditional response after an aviation security incident, you get all the talking heads on TV, and you've got on one side people are saying get rid of TSA, return security screening to the private sector, right? That's their answer. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have folks that say the U.S. needs to adopt the Israeli profiling security model. That's the only way to go. And then you've got in the middle folks that are saying, well, if you could just improve the technology and improve the performance of the officer, it's a human and technology issue, and you're not meeting expectations because you're failing in both of those areas. But there was no objective analysis being done. It was all subjective opinion. I think the Israeli model is better. I think privatization model is better. And so I wrote my paper on an objective comparison of those three approaches: the status quo, the Israeli model, and a risk-based security model. But the hard part was, once the decision was made that we were going to move in that direction, turning that vision of a risk-based security into reality. It's kind of like the Untucked commercial, right? With a few simple design changes. And at a theoretical, it's a few simple design changes. You identify folks that are low risk, you send them to a separate screening process, and you allow them expedited in compared to standard. But in reality, what's the criteria used to designate an individual as low risk? What information can you draw upon? Should you be using an individual's social media information? Should you be using information from credit bureaus? How do you what public information is available? Once you've identified an individual, what can you share with your governmental partners? How do you separate, families from, so there's a whole host of details beyond even when you get to, okay, so now I understand the approach I want to take. I can get buy-in from the intelligence community and the privacy and civil liberties community in Washington and the airlines and the passenger advocates groups that this is the right way to go. But then you wind up with, what are the physical design changes that need to be made to the checkpoint in order to be able to enable this? How do you prevent someone from fraudulently altering their boarding pass in order to be able to game the system and get expedited screening because they don't want to either go through the inconvenience of standard screening or because they have some nefarious intent and they think this is an easier way to get through? So there's, the devil is truly in the detail as you're trying to take a theoretical construct and turn it into an operational reality. And that took, from the time the decision was made to move forward with a pilot of risk-based security in March of 2011, early March of 2011. We didn't initiate the first pilot until early October of that year. So there was, a good 7-month span of effort to put all that in, to reconfigure the airline reservation systems, to find airline partners that were willing to serve as the guinea pigs, to, huge amount of policy questions that needed to be answered. And at the same time, risk-based security represented a fundamental rejection of the one-size-fits-all equal risk philosophy that the government had taken to aviation security since the 9/11 terrorist attacks. That do better job, more thorough screening was embedded in the national strategy for Homeland Security, the national strategy for combating terrorism travel. All of these macro policy documents were reinforcing this idea that anyone could go bad and therefore you couldn't really say that anyone could be trusted. And it just, when you think about it, where we were and where we are today, that philosophy was, that was we were on a losing trajectory as an agency. It made absolutely no sense. Yeah. You were never going to resource your way out of the problem.
And of course, some of the challenges that you mentioned, part of it also is how knowledgeable many of the decision makers in the government are of the techniques of risk management and decision analysis. Right. We wrote a paper and we discussed some other methods that are widely used. So perhaps there's also an educational mission in getting them to buy in on some of the risk management techniques.
Well, absolutely. And one of the first things that I committed to when I became the chief risk officer was establishing a real strong partnership with the academic community, working with you you when you were the director of the Create Center out here at USC, and with other academics around the country that were focused on the aviation security and the risk management challenges, because you bring an entirely different perspective to and a different knowledge base, theoretical in some cases rather than applied, but huge value add. And the secondary benefit is working closely with the academic community when something goes bad. And as you remind me often, Ali, just because you've taken the right approach to making the decision and you've made a rational decision doesn't mean that the outcome is going to be what you want it to be. So when something goes bad, you've got independent validators that can say the agency really did due diligence as they were analyzing the alternatives. They really did seek experts in the field from around the country in order to be able to put this dramatic change in public policy together and then implement it, refine it, and mature it over time.
And that's some of the things, Ken, that we say is that when you're in that position, society generally tends to judge by the outcome, and they're not aware of the types of analysis. I want to ask you personally, while you were at the TSA, I mean, we were hearing some stories in the newspapers, for example, some of the officers at the field, doing unethical behavior, taking pictures, or how did you feel when you would read something like that?
In a job like security, passenger security, it only takes one individual to taint the entire organization. And every time one of those stories happened, it was like being punched in the gut. We're making progress. We're beginning to turn the industry, the passenger, the public community, the political leaders in Washington to our side. For a long time, TSA was the convenient whipping boy. And I used to joke, well, maybe some starlet will get thrown into rehab and take us off the front page for a day. Any relief was good relief. Before we started risk-based security, more than 75% of the media coverage on the agency was negative, and the rest was neutral. There was just a small slice that was positive. And every one of those isolated incidents of employee misconduct was magnified. Every frontline security officer wearing a uniform was tarred with that same brush. You're all pedophiles. You're all thieves. You're all criminals. You're all unethical. And the contrary, the reality is absolutely to the contrary. I mean, these are people that are absolutely dedicated to the mission of ensuring that you and your family are going to be able to get on your airplane at your departure airport, and you're going to arrive at your destination airport as safe and secure as you were when you left.
In fact, these are probably generalizations, and generalizations in general isn't good. Ken, do you feel the TSA went too far?
That's an interesting question, and I think in some respects, we did. Risk-based security, because of not just the dramatic change in political, public, and media perception of the agency. When I left the agency at the end of 2016, I talked about in 2011 when we started, more than 75% of the stories were negative. When I left at the end of 2016, more than 80% of the stories were either positive or neutral. We had completely turned that perception and acceptance of the agency around. And we were also saving hundreds of millions of dollars a year by the efficiencies we were gaining from taking a lot of people out of standard screening and putting them into an expedited screening lane. I used to tell my colleagues at the agency that became like a drug. We became hooked on operational efficiency. The more people you can identify as low risk. And one of the mistakes I think we made, and what allowed us in some cases to take a step farther than certainly some of the political leaders were comfortable with, was we looked at every incremental change to pre-check relative to where we were today, rather than the baseline of where we started. And so when you look at it, this is a 1-inch change, but we've already come a yard. So, so this is 37 inches from where we started, and the inability to go back and really assess the full scope of change that we had made in relation to when we started, I think allowed us to get hooked. And so what's the methadone treatment to TSA PreCheck? We were trying to sort that out as I left the agency. How do we get more people to enroll in the program than in some of those other areas? The challenge that we confronted when we tried to remove items from the prohibited items list, I think I still bear scars from that experience, was another where we completely underestimated the reaction we were going to get from, in particular, pilots and flight attendant unions, and how that would coalesce into opposition to that change in Congress and in the media. It was the right, rational security decision to be looking for a small penknife when we know that that is distracting the officer from finding the improvised explosive device. It was the right security decision. If our mission is to prevent catastrophic consequences, an IED being blown up in the middle of its flight at altitude, versus somebody nefariously using a penknife, or a pen in their pocket, or other things that are already allowed or already on board the aircraft that are probably equally as deadly and dangerous in the hands of somebody that wants to use them that way. It made no sense, but we underestimated the reaction. We were again kind of hooked on our own success. Nobody had raised a barrier to any of the changes we had been making, and we were on a roll. And this was just the next natural step in that evolution. It was a bridge too far.
What are some of the things that you would have liked to see happen while you were Chief Risk Officer, or that you would like to see happen today?
Our target at the very beginning should have been low-risk travelers dominated by people that were enrolled in a trusted traveler program, or by virtue of the position that they held in government, were known to be low risk. Top secret clearance holders, members of the military, et cetera. In 2013, after we had exceeded our first 2012 milestone with national rollout, the first milestone was we started the pilot at 2 airlines and 5 airports. And when we made the decision to go national in the spring of 2012, the initial target was, we're going to roll this out to the top 20 airports in the country. We were at 27, so we exceeded our goal. And so the administrator at the time said, well, I think we ought to start seeing some efficiencies to be, savings, resource reductions, both people and financial. I want you to get to 25%. Your goal is 25% expedited screening by the end of 2013 and 50% expedited screening by the end of 2014. So 25-50 became a mantra that drove a lot of policy decisions. And I think combined with change in political leadership at the department, you can imagine the weekly and sometimes daily conversations that were being had with the Secretary of Homeland Security and the Deputy Secretary, with the National Security Advisor and the National Security Council at the White House, with the oversight committees in Congress, with the intel community, as we were building this program, looking to them to validate the changes, working with us to do the analysis. As the new leadership team came in, when Secretary Johnson took over, there was... first of all, DHS is a huge animal, right? And so new leaders they've got a lot of landscape they've got to come up to speed on. And so being able to get their time and attention to explain to them at the level of detail that we had with the previous DHS leadership, we kind of backed off. We tried. I remember going up to visit and do a briefing for the DHS Chief of Staff on the aspect of the program that we thought was really critical, because I sensed the DHS Inspector General was not a proponent of where we were headed. And so we had a half-hour meeting with him, 20 minutes of which he was watching the Secretary give a speech. And paying scant attention to what we had to say. And so rather than beating your head on the wall and trying to break through, eventually it became less emphasis on making sure you were feeding the political beast above the agency, so that when you did things like try and remove small pocket knives from the prohibited items list, they were more fully informed about what got us to this point and why this was the right decision.
Talking about the future, I have a few questions, especially in the role of public policy. I mean, we hear today, for example, that large data sets are leaked and they could have possibly influenced some of the elections. We hear about perhaps the need to monitor how companies are using private data, and people in public policy will have to catch up with all the advances in artificial intelligence and drones. And what are your thoughts on this? I mean, how can the government be on top of all of the advances that are happening and be in a position where they can accurately make decisions about information as we go into this information age?
I think going forward, there is a much greater need for sound collaborative governance structures. The days of government inside the insulated walls of Washington, developing policy and throwing it over the wall and expecting the American people or a particular industry to respond to that, either through notice and comment if it's a proposed policy, or to respond to it if it's an emergency implementation, without their collaboration, without building that level of trust between organizations at a personal and an organizational level that's necessary for collaborative governance to really work. That's the only way that I see that government can stay abreast of not just those changes in technological changes, the changes in the external environment in which government operates, because you're never going to have all of the experts there. But it gives you a much better insight into what are not just the intended consequences, but what are the second and third order unintended consequences of this policy decision. So the top line may look great, but it's that underlying, so if we look at, as we did in our paper, the loss of an aircraft is a $43 billion event, a 170 passenger aircraft. When you don't look at secondary and tertiary economic consequences, when you begin to factor that in, it's a $400 billion event. So the 10 times order of magnitude in order to be able to really understand the implications of that. Government needs to take the time to understand fully the positives and the negative outcomes that their policy is going to engender. But the challenge is that where industry sees value to them parochially, they are more than willing to collaborate and cooperate. But that collaboration and cooperation doesn't automatically extend to the next issue. It's an issue by issue. So the challenge, and I'm not Pollyanna about it, is when you begin to build those relationships, nurture them between issues. So when you get to that next one, you've got that foundation laid to where you can get open and honest dialogue from someone that may be vehemently opposed because they see this as, the financial death knell of the organization, or it's going to, shave their profits. On the reverse side, it provides government with insight into changes in industry, changes that could be disruptive to government operations. So, my example from TSA is when airlines imposed checked baggage fees. And that was, that was the first couple of airlines that did that. That was, closely held proprietary business-sensitive information. Government was not aware that we were doing that, certainly at the local level when that went into place at O'Hare. We saw dramatic change in the amount of carry-on bags that people were bringing through the checkpoint, and the amount of stuff that was crammed in the carry-on bags that significantly aggravated that challenge. And then you would get the complaints from industry about, well, your wait times at the checkpoint are long because we're going slower and we're doing more bag checks because the bag is so cluttered, and you're making $3 billion a year on your bag check fees. There was a better way on both sides of the equation for us to come to a better solution. but that level of trust between government and industry. Government will never be aware of the disruptive influences, the new novel risks that are beginning to develop in the external environment that are either going to provide opportunities for government to improve or are going to present significant challenges for government to operate in that new environment going forward, unless they develop that collaborative governance approach. That, in my view, that's key.
What advice would you give for this upcoming generation getting into public policy and, starting their careers in the area?
Don't get discouraged. I was commenting to you earlier. I was repeating back a comment that you had made to me that the closer you get to the political realm, the more that rational decision making kind of breaks down, and I think we see examples of that over, certainly over time that we can point to. But the higher you get in the organization, as my wife told me once, we took our daughters to see the Nutcracker, and we had great seats right close to the stage, and they were appalled at the sewing of the stitches and the costumes. Well, the closer you get to the sausage making, the more disheartening it becomes. Don't lose faith. Don't give up. Pick your battles. You can't afford to be viewed as a gadfly or righteously wedded to, you have to do it this way, you have to make sound decisions. Some decisions are significantly more important than others. So pick your battles, get into positions where you can, where you have the ability to influence, build a reputation of professionalism, of ethical conduct. You need to build a network of people both inside government, outside of government. I was listening to a congressman who came to talk to one of our master's program classes, and he commented that the best way to change government policy is to exploit a crisis. Right? Where policymakers are looking for, where they're faced with a crisis and they need a solution. If you have a solution, they're going to turn to you regardless of how good or bad it is, and they're going to give it, a good consideration. And when I thought about that, my initial reaction was, how self-serving, that just, another jaded, political leader who's going to exploit for partisan purposes, a national crisis. And the more I thought about it, and now that I reflect on my own experiences with my policy proposal for risk-based security, it's not about exploitation in a negative sense. It's about exploiting, recognizing when the conditions exist that allow a dramatic change in policy to be considered. As you and I have talked a lot, Ali, government decision makers are by nature risk averse. They're cautious. They think short term. They're worried about, if the average tenure of a political leader is 2.5 years, they're worried about, what is the legacy I can build over the next 30 months rather than what's the legacy I'm leaving 15 or 20 years from now? Yeah. So when conditions are right, you need to be in a position to be able to influence the decision that's being made. And the best way to do that is professional reputation in positions that are difficult. The closer you can get to the seat of decision making, the better off you are in having your voice heard. And having a large internal and external network that values you and recognizes your work. But don't give up. Don't be disheartened. Don't become jaded if you come to Washington. It's easy to do. Former Secretary Tillerson talked about, Washington can be a mean-spirited town, but you don't have to engage in that. You're absolutely right. It can be a mean-spirited town. Don't engage in the petty internal politics of the organization. That's not going to put you in a position where you're going to have the opportunity to recognize when the conditions are right and then influence the ultimate policy decision that's being made.
Ken, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.